Through a miracle of fate, you have saved the Roman Empire from destruction. But the passage of time is relentless, and what endures for a period won't last forever. Men of great power and piety will transform the world, as ancient antiquity transitions to a new era. Will prosperity and opulence follow your wake? Or will the empire soon face total annihilation by its enemies, both old and new? Welcome to History's Influence. Before we begin, be sure to like and subscribe to help this small channel along its journey to 10,000 subscribers. I'd also like to give a big shout out to my patrons, Mintark YT and Dark Age Sage. Now, onto the video. This video will work as a standalone exploration, but it is also part 2 in my What If the Western Roman Empire Never Fell series. In the first part, we saw Emperor Majorian successfully invade Africa in 461 and enact a series of effective reforms to save Western Rome. This would prevent its fall in 476 AD, which happened historically. The empire would still recede, however, surviving only in Italy, Africa, and Illyria, albeit with a government which was strengthened and less corrupt. This is not to mention their more effective tax base, and having a military which had become less Germanic barbarian and more Roman in composition. Such stabilization will be put to the test from the 6th century onwards, as new developments will continue to challenge the empire, particularly from the east, be it the trajectory of the Eastern Empire or the arrival of Islam into Africa. Will West Rome survive these trials and tribulations whilst keeping Germanic barbarians at bay? Let's find out, shall we? The 6th century will see a West Rome in a reduced state. But like what happened historically, the Eastern Roman Empire, also known as the Byzantine Empire, would be larger and wealthier than ever, and far more so than the West. They were going through an economic boom. In our own timeline, the Byzantines would use their stronger power base to install puppet emperors in the weakening West. They didn't recognize all Western emperors as a result, especially if they would usurp the throne, like Majorian. But in this new timeline, we will instead assume that the Eastern Emperor Leo I recognizes Majorian. Key reasons would include their shared existential conflicts with Germanic generals, Majorian's lengthy and successful reign, his impressive power base, and he will choose to cooperate with the East. This will put East-West relations on good footing, and prevent the idea of Western subjugation to the East onwards, considering their independent power base by this point. This is most relevant to the later Eastern Emperor Justinian, who reigned from 527 to 565. He would go on to reconquer lands the barbarians conquered from Rome, but would Justinian still exist in this new timeline? Moving forward, we will be assuming the birth and rise to power for two key figures which came after Majorian's time, the Byzantine Emperor Justinian and the founding prophet of Islam, Muhammad. Contingent factors from part 1 wouldn't have prevented such things from occurring, be it the succession of Eastern emperors coming before Justinian leading to him, or the small, out-of-the-way Arab town of Mecca's relationship with the outside world by this point. So in this new timeline, Justinian will exist, but so will the Western Empire, which will have most of the territories he conquered historically. Considering this context, would Justinian instead choose to send expeditionary forces to perhaps help the Western Empire reconquer Gaul, Hispania, and possibly Britain? Well, there's a few factors to consider. In our timeline, Justinian needed to limit the troops provided in his Reconquest efforts. This is because he was preoccupied by other frontiers which won't be changing. And in this new timeline, his Eastern Empire would not be directly benefiting from such an expedition anyway. This wasn't the Eastern-led invasion of Africa in 468, in which the Western Emperor was a Byzantine puppet, for example. The West would have their own empire and their own governmental policy. The taxes won't be going to Justinian. This is not to mention the logistical costs and challenges of sending tens of thousands of troops so far westwards, if even. A grueling campaign in Gaul or Hispania against the Franks or Visigoths would be a nightmare for the distant Byzantines. Just conquering Italy in our own timeline took Justinian 19 wars of brutal warfare. This was far closer to home, and was devastating for Italy's population and economy. It also left the peninsula so weak that another round of Germanic conquest soon followed. Furthermore, the West could not pursue such reconquests themselves. They were kicked out of the provinces in the first place, and wouldn't have the scale of power needed to make such aggressive attacks. So if both empires won't be reconquering provinces to the west, What's Justinian going to do instead, being far less preoccupied than he was historically? His internal reforms will remain similar. Justinian inherited a hefty treasury, which he used to great effect historically. Expect the Hagia Sophia to still be built, alongside other religious and civic constructions. I would expect more buildings, given the lower spending needed for warfare. His codification of Roman law will still occur, but this time it's also going to affect the law of the Western Empire. His religious reforms, recognizing the 5 key centers of Christianity, will be worked with in conjunction with the Western Empire this time. Their capital's Roman Constantinople would be considered part of this arrangement. Looking at foreign policy, Justinian's going to do a better job of defending against brutal attacks from Persia, thanks to less Western warfare. This will maintain a safer stalemate against the powerful Persian Shah, Khosrow I, arguably the greatest of the Sassanid Empire, who Justinian had to deal with historically. More important would be the front of the Balkans. All of that ambition, which I'm sure he'd be itching to get out, will come to play into this region. In part 1, we established a 3-way power dynamic in the Balkans. I believe Justinian will work with West Rome to conquer the Ostrogoths, and will be conquering a larger portion of land than the weaker West. The Ostrogoths fought the Byzantines historically, but this is when they controlled all of Italy. In this case, they're going to get crushed. But they would not be the only enemy of the Romans within the Balkans. The adoption of agriculture and other technologies allowed for Slavic peoples to increase in population. Starting in 518, 9 years before Justinian's reign, the Slavs would raid into the Balkans, eventually leading to full-scale migrations. But being far less distracted in this new timeline, Justinian will keep Slavic raiding in check far more effectively, supported by strong military victories. He will also establish fortifications along the Danube for further protection, in conjunction with West Rome. This means the raids will be strongly reduced, and won't be intensifying over time into these large-scale migrations. The population also won't be reduced from such raids. The region will maintain its Latin and Greek-speaking populations, be it the Illyrians, Thracians, Greeks, etc. This will provide manpower and taxes for better defense, and also discourage further migration because there'd be more people there in the first place. But this also means none of the Slavic Balkan nations we know and love will exist, with their unique histories and cultures, or their comment section flame wars. Instead, the Slavs will migrate en masse into Pannonia, enveloping the Gepids and other local groups. They will also supplement Slavic migration further west, but will be blocked eastwards by nomadic domination. Speaking of nomadic domination, the Avars from East Asia will still be arriving and conquering Pannonia after Justinian's reign. The Slavs didn't have strong unified states by this point to resist them, but the Slavs would strongly outnumber the Avars and other groups in the Pannonian Basin. As a result, they will eventually assimilate the Avar elites into a Slavic empire under the Avar name. This is similar to how the Turkic Bulgars merged with a majority Slavic population in the Balkans to create Bulgaria. Anyway, holding the Slavs out past the Danube would be a massive victory for Justinian, but his reign would still face a serious problem. Justinian's plague will still break out from Egypt in 451 AD and devastate Byzantium. Being a bubonic plague like the Black Death, it ravaged the Roman and Persian worlds, even going as far west as Gaul. This was especially bad because cities were hit the worst. Cities acted as highly populated hotbeds of specialization, so losing their population drastically would harm both East and West Rome in this new timeline. However, it's not very well understood how seriously the plague impacted the Roman world. Death estimates are speculatory. It seems to have coincided with economic decline, but I don't believe this was substantial enough to strongly redefine their political situations, especially considering many of their neighbours would be suffering from the same disease anyway. The Germanic kingdoms of the Visigoths and Franks will see the remaining cities in their territories be depopulated further, helping continue their transition to more agrarian economies and feudal governments. Furthermore, the lack of warfare devastation in Italy or the Balkans will keep those regions well defended. It's often argued that the Balkans were depopulated by the disease, but the evidence for such an occurrence is sparse. It's more a post hoc explanation as to why the Slavic migrations happened than anything else. And the Avars hadn't arrived in Pannonia yet either, which will keep the region relatively safe for the Romans. So I would say the Eastern and Western empires wouldn't be harmed too much in this new timeline. Justinian's successors will have a stronger empire, despite the damage of the plague. Less overstretched, the Balkans far more secure, a stronger position against the Persians, and likely more savings without drawn-out warfare in the west. In this context, the Byzantines will not face an existential war against the Persians, as they did in their final conflict historically. This conflict, which I've personally coined the Twilight War, I'll spread the word, had devastated both empires, leaving them exposed for conquest. This was an enticing opportunity the Arab Muslims would take to conquer many of their lands. We will assume that the founder of Islam, Muhammad, will still be born in around 570 AD, into distant Arabia. He will unify Arabia under Islamic control with his genius leadership, even if certain tribes resist with Roman or Persian assistance. His successors would begin to expand right as the Twilight War ended, a fantastic opportunity to defeat two overstretched empires. But the Arabs held more strengths than just political and religious unity, alongside the weakness of the other two empires. For starters, the economic and population decline caused by Justinian's plague wouldn't have had a large impact on nomad Arabia. Looking at the Arabs themselves, they were a hardy and nomadic people, conquering the sedentary civilizations from the outskirts. This is a common trope in history they simply fulfilled, which makes sense given their geographic location and rough terrain. Not to mention, their highly mobile cavalry-based warfare was devastating to the stalemate of Roman-Persian style warfare. This was further boosted by their religious fervour for jihad. They were also led by genius military generals like Ibn Khalid al-Walid. We will assume these generals still exist in this new timeline. The Arabs were also strongly underestimated by the Romans and Persians. This is because the Arabs were pretty irrelevant for most of their histories, so they didn't really have proper defences ready to go. There was also religious disunity between the Monophysite Christians of Egypt and Syria as opposed to the Chalcedonian Christians of East and West Rome, alongside the Nestorian Christians within the Zoroastrian Sassanid Empire. Such religious disfavour increased during the Twilight War, which won't be happening in this new timeline, but the tensions will still exist regardless. Speaking more broadly, the Arabs would have all the incentive in the world to continuously invade Roman Persia, with their superior military tactics keeping them on the offensive. Arabia was quite a poor region after all. This wasn't an era of skyscrapers and Lamborghinis. Conquering wealthy lands and establishing themselves as an elite would have been a very appealing arrangement. They also held a strong manpower pool from numerous tribes. Additionally, they could also reinforce their raids and battles by dipping back into Arabia, which happened in the Battle of Yarmouk historically, which is what won them the Levant region. Such persistence would be a huge struggle for the bloated, bureaucratic, and diplomacy-minded empires of the Romans and Persians. But Arab infighting is not to be understated. If too many military losses occur, or the Byzantines and Persians prove too resilient to have their provinces overrun, the Arab state might fracture or be made impotent through civil strife. But if we consider all of the factors we've discussed, the Arabs will still conquer plenty of land. However, this would be a more brutal and protracted conflict. Syria and Mesopotamia would be dangerously exposed to Arab attack and be conquered fairly quickly. This would isolate Egypt and the Persian heartland of Fars for further conquest. Egypt will be taken after some brutal warfare, with West Rome's naval support and a token force helping reduce the speed. Looking east, I'd still expect the Persian Empire to fall, for a few reasons. Firstly, the Sassanid reliance on heavy cavalry was especially weak to Arab light cavalry. The Sassanid Empire had pretty serious dynastic strife after the end of the Twilight War, but even before the war, they were beginning to have some dynastic disputes. They might not have been in a peachy position in this new timeline to face the Arabs anyway. So, the Arabs will still be conquering an impressive empire. They would continue to go west historically, but they would now have a new opponent to face. In our own timeline, the Byzantines lost the Exarchate of Africa from the Arabs. This was a protracted conflict which nearly lasted 50 years, much longer than the initial wave of Arab expansion. The Byzantines by this point were more familiar with Arab tactics. They also won solid victories and received effective military aid from the local Berber tribes. They would continue to persist through naval reinforcements to well-established cities. Whilst Byzantium held up a good fight, the Western Empire would be in a far stronger position to defend the province. Africa won't be the autonomous region of an overstretched empire, but a breadbasket helping serve the beating heart of Italy. so it would be considered far more crucial for the empire's survival. Naval reinforcements could be sent more quickly, and the West Romans wouldn't be preoccupied against the Arabs elsewhere, like the Byzantines were in Anatolia. West Rome would have also had a few more decades to develop a positive relationship with the Berbers. As mentioned in part 1, they would be a large presence in the military, given the West's smaller manpower pool than the East. We also would have had a slower conquest of Egypt, giving the East and West Romans more time to familiarise themselves with Arab tactics. This also would have slowed down the sheer momentum of the conquests, which may contribute to more Arab infighting. Most importantly, historically, the Arabs would destroy cities such as Carthage, which removed the prospect of Byzantine reinforcement and even civilization. I suppose it's karma for the Romans because of that time they salted the earth of Carthage. Sorry, Punics. Anyway, in this new timeline, we're going to see the region better protected from such a threat of destruction. Stronger Roman defense, weaker Arab offense, and stronger fortifications would help prevent this worst case scenario from happening as it did. All of these factors make it clear that the Western Empire will keep the province of Africa. The consequences for the region would be enormous. The local Berbers will continue to be Christianized and be influenced by Roman civilization, as opposed to being on the cutting edge of the burgeoning Islamic world. The Visigoths in Iberia will also not be conquered by the Arabs. We will discuss their fate as we go on. A larger scale change coming from the defense of Africa would come in the trading dynamic of the Mediterranean. The historic Arab invasions split Mediterranean trade in half, but they won't push past Egypt in this new timeline, and would need to face the combined naval strength of the Western and Eastern Roman empires. This will also prevent them from pursuing piracy and island conquest. The Arabs will instead opt to trade with the Christians. This would create a trading situation more similar to the Roman Empire of old. This would be a huge deal for the long-term advancement of these peoples. This will, for example, reduce the Dark Age effect Byzantium faced from the Arab conquests, further reduced by the maintenance of a populous Balkans, and their close links to West Rome. But it would also reduce or remove benefits from the Islamic Golden Age, including centres of great wealth and learning such as Cordoba in modern Spain. Further economic, governmental, and technological changes will be discussed later. And making further predictions regarding the Arabs and Muslims would be outside the scope of this video. But expect the Arabization of lands such as Egypt and the Levant, a Persian cultural resistance, and perhaps increased attacks into India. With Italy safe from Vandal raids, the capital of the Western Empire will move back to Rome. This will keep their capital further away from the Germanic threats to the north. It will also keep the capital closer to receive goods from Africa in a safe Roman Mediterranean, and it would help them influence and control the Bishop of Rome, who would later become the Pope, which we'll be getting back to later. The West Roman army will become more and more Roman in makeup as nearby Germanic groups will settle within conquered territories, rather than continuing to seek work with the Romans. The recruitment in the stable and protected provinces will increase over time, alongside auxiliary forces from Berbers and the like. But what about the placement of troops? The Western Roman army was divided between a central army and provincial armies defending borders historically, just as the Byzantines were. After the Arab invasions in our own timeline, the Byzantines would more strongly rely upon regional defense, particularly against Arab raids into Anatolia. Because they lost their wealthiest provinces in Egypt and the Levant, and so couldn't fund as large of a central army, they began providing land grants to soldiers in return for military service, although such grants were not hereditary, as in passed into the family into the future. In this new timeline, the Byzantines would preserve more wealth from the Balkans, and not need to defend as many regions navally, and be trading more. Anatolian defense will remain similar against the Arabs, but because of the other benefits, a central army would be better funded. The same would especially be the case for West Rome, who would maintain Africa. Regardless, they will provide wealthy African estates to soldiers, in return for service in the Arab and Berber frontiers. Relations with the Berbers won't always be peachy. This would follow the precedent from the last video, when Majorian provided land grants to soldiers who helped conquer Africa in the first place. Looking past money or land, a more mobile, cavalry-based warfare will be adopted by both Roman empires, given the tactics applied by their enemies, the Arabs and Avars. These were no longer the infantry armies commanded by Julius Caesar, who would build roads and makeshift fortifications. Groups such as the Avars will still spread inventions such as the stirrup, which will spread west to the Germanic kingdoms. Germanic groups such as the Franks were beaten back by Majorian in Part 1, but their ideal positioning, and not being completely defeated, will allow them to conquer the regions they did historically. Northern Gaul will provide a fertile and populous power base for the Franks to expand outwards from, especially in comparison to other barbarian-controlled regions. However, the Salic law of the Franks would weaken their strength, which would divide a dead king's land to his sons. But after such periods of disunity, they would later reunify and expand outwards, under strong leadership. These pauses will help their neighbours, particularly the Visigoths in West Rome, remain safe. The Visigoths would also have the defensible Pyrenees mountain range, and wouldn't perform Arab-style raids, which invited conquests into Islamic Iberia historically. West Rome would also remain well defended, with the Alps and a strong army to boot. This wouldn't be a fragmented Italy under Lombard and Byzantine control, with an autonomous pope calling for Frankish assistance. The Franks will still expand eastwards, however, albeit with stronger Slavic resistance thanks to the increased migrations. This will reduce their gains. Germanic groups such as the Lombards will instead be overwhelmed and defeated by larger Slavic numbers, becoming less relevant in history. Speaking of Slavs, the Slavicized Avars would be a powerful state. I'm sure attempts of invasion and raids into Roman territory will occur. This won't cause the Romans to lose the region later, however. Remember that the endemic raiding of the Slavs would simply not have happened before the Arab invasions. Their populated, fortified, and shared control of the Balkans will prevent migrations afterwards too. Nice try there, Slavs. And with that, we can say that West Rome has still survived the challenges of the 6th and 7th centuries, still keeping its territories from Part 1 of the series. But how would culture, identity, language, and religion develop in this new timeline? And with the maintenance of a Roman-style government and economy in Italy and Africa, how would the Dark Ages and feudalism develop? Or would they even develop in the first place? And would the West Romans, or even East Romans, survive in the long run in this ever-changing world? All these questions and more will be answered in Part 3, the final part of the series. This has been History's Influence. Thank you for watching. Be sure to like, comment, and subscribe. Catch you later.